NAIS community, thank you so much for having me. We're here to talk about your ideas. We're here to talk about the future. But first, I want to take you about 100 years into the past, to the story of a doctor named Alexander Fleming. Now, Dr. Fleming is on the front lines of World War I. And Dr. Fleming is frustrated because thousands upon thousands of soldiers are dying, but they're not dying from their wounds. They're dying from infection. And there's not anything in Dr. Fleming's toolkit that can save them. So when Fleming leaves the war, he vows that he's going to find a cure to this problem. And in the 1920s, he does. He discovers a mold that stops the spread of bacteria. Well, now, he is so excited about this new discovery because he knows it's going to help a lot of people. But in order to make his vision real, he needs resources. He needs people. He needs lab space. He needs money. And the best place to find those resources was the Medical Research Club of London. This was a group of scientists and investors, thought leaders. If you had a new idea, these were the people who could make it happen. But there was only one problem. Dr. Fleming was a talented physician, but he was not a talented communicator. And when it came time to give his presentation, he fumbled through his findings, he stuttered through his conclusion. Needless to say, he did not get the resources that he needed that night. But instead of approaching other investors, he decided to take his discovery, he put it on a shelf, and he walked away. Well, over the next 10 years, things got really bad for infection. Hundreds of thousands of people dying from their wounds, until another physician by the name of Dr. Howard Florey comes along and says, enough is enough. We need to find an answer to this problem. So Florey begins to comb through all of the research that he could find when he discovers an article that had been written by Dr. Alexander Fleming. And Dr. Fleming had even given his discovery a name. He called it penicillin. Well, Dr. Florey springs to action. He calls up Dr. Fleming. He says, we've got to work on this together. And together, they rally scientists. They bring in investors. They partner with retailers. And within a few years, they make penicillin into something you could find at the local pharmacy. To date, penicillin has saved nearly 200 million lives. And it was an invention that almost never existed. NAIS community, it is so wonderful to be here with you. You are creative leaders growing future generations of creative leaders. And as we know, creativity and persuasion are two different skills. You could have a great idea, you could have a great product, you could be a great candidate, and still be dismissed. All of that got me interested in the idea of backable people. These are people who can walk into a room and really rally us around a vision, really rally us around their ideas. And I wanted to understand, what is that quality all about? What is this mysterious it quality? And could it be learned? And so what I did is I started spending time with hundreds of backable people, studying their behaviors, studying their habits, from Oscar-winning filmmakers to Michelin star chefs to founders of iconic companies. And what I found is that backable truly is a set of qualities that any of us can learn. Being backable is not just for celebrities, it's not just for CEOs, it's for all of us to take what's inside of us and bring it into the world. And so today, I want to share just a few of those qualities with you. And for each of these qualities, I also want to give you very, very specific techniques, things that you can put into practice immediately. So let's begin with quality number one, which is to flip outsiders into insiders. Flip outsiders into insiders. What do we mean by that? Well, let me take you back to the 1940s for a moment now. Betty Crocker has just unveiled instant cake mix to markets all over the country. But what they found is that instant cake mix wasn't selling, and they were really surprised because all you had to do was pour water into a mix, put it in a pan, put it in the oven, and voila, you got this tasty treat. Who wouldn't want that? But they realized that sales were abysmal, and they wanted to figure out why. And so they hired a psychologist named Ernest Dykta to go out and talk to homemakers around the country. And what Dykta discovered is that they had made the process of making a cake too easy, too simple. They had all but removed the customer from the creative process. So Dykta's recommendation was to remove one ingredient, take out one ingredient from the mix, and see what happens. And so they removed the egg. What they needed to do now as a customer is you needed to actually crack and mix in your own fresh egg. And sales took off. Researchers have since unpacked this idea, this effect, and they call it the IKEA effect. And the IKEA effect tells us that we value something that we build up to 5 times more than something that we simply buy off the shelf. And so there are a lot of people out there with poorly made futons and furniture that they're never going to get rid of because they built it themselves. So what does this have anything to do with creativity and innovation? Well, we've been told that creativity is a 2-step formula. You got a great idea with great execution. But it turns out there is a hidden step in between. This is where you bring in early partners, early people, early employees into your idea so that when you reach the execution phase, you reach it together. These are people who feel like they are builders alongside with you, not buyers. These are people who feel like insiders. And you can trace every successful company, every successful organization, every successful movement back to this hidden step. So the question is then, specifically, how do we flip outsiders into insiders? What are the techniques that we can put into practice? Well, the first is that when you walk into a room, share what it could be, not how it has to be. With your idea, share what it could be, not how it has to be. You know, the folks at Intel used to have a saying, which is to fall in love with the problem, not the solution. Fall in love with your problem, but not the solution. There was a designer that I spoke to for this book who worked at companies like Microsoft and Google. So bigger companies where you have to rally lots and lots of people around a creative idea. It's no easy task, as we know. And one of the things that he would do is he would walk into these meetings with high-fidelity designs and visuals for what it is that he was trying to build. They were pixel perfect, they looked really great, and he was frustrated because he found that these meetings would go nowhere. Well, one day by accident, he leaves his laptop behind, and so he doesn't have his designs with him. So he walks into this meeting, he apologizes for not having these designs, and then instead, he goes to a whiteboard and he starts to draw out his vision, right? Just draw it out in black and white on the whiteboard. And what he finds, surprisingly, is that people get more engaged than they ever had before. People are up and out of their seats. They're coming to the whiteboard with him. They're drawing alongside of him. And all of a sudden, these people who felt like outsiders in this process are starting to feel like insiders. So sharing what your vision could be, but not necessarily how it has to be. Now, I come to this subject as a founder, as an entrepreneur, and I was frustrated because I was pitching investor after investor, and I continued to hear no over and over again. And so one of the first meetings I had was with the founder of a company called TaskRabbit. And I sat down with her and I asked her, like, what am I doing wrong here? And she looked at my slide deck and she said, look, 80% of your slides are up front and only 20% of your slides are for discussion. You should flip that, reverse that. Bring 20% of your slides up front, lay out the vision, but then save a bunch of it for discussion. You only want to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes and then open it up for the creative possibilities that will come up inside the room. And when I flipped that, and when I went from 20% up front and 80% for discussion, everything changed because I was able to treat outsiders like insiders, bring them into the idea. The second thing that I like to keep in mind very specifically for a technique for flipping outsiders to insiders is to tell what I call the story of us. The story of us. Oftentimes we walk into a meeting and we like to tell the story of me, the story of my candidacy, the story of my idea. But what we really want to do is we want to tell the story of us. How the story of me and the story of you come together to tell the story of us. One of the people I spoke to for this book is the head of the MacArthur Foundation, which awards the Genius Grant to people like Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator of Hamilton. And one of the things he told me was very surprising is that if you are a candidate, if you're somebody they're considering for the grant, and you're already on a clear path to success, that will make you a less likely candidate to receive the grant. It will make you a weaker candidate. Because they don't want to make somebody's success that is already inevitable more inevitable. They want to impact someone's career. They want to help change somebody's trajectory. And I think we all sort of feel that way as human beings. We want to know that we made a difference. So when we walk into a room, we don't want to just tell the story of me. We want to tell the story of us, how our two stories come together, how your strengths and mine can form a greater vision together. Tell the story of us. The third thing you want to do is really as soon as possible, you want to switch from presentation mode into what I call huddle mode. Huddle mode. Where instead of me just talking to you, we're actually huddled around something together. When I spoke to a woman named Maureen Taylor, she's a coach for a lot of the celebrity CEOs out there, mainly in Silicon Valley, mainly in tech. And, a lot of them are very nervous, she told me, before they walk into the room. And one of the key pieces of advice she gives somebody before they walk into a big meeting is that when you walk in, you're going to feel like there's a spotlight that's on you. Your job is to take that spotlight and to turn it towards your idea. And one of the best ways that we can do that is by sharing something visual, something that we can both look at together. People are far more compelling, I have found, when they are showing something rather than describing it. That could be an app, that could be, videos of a customer testimonial, it could be teachers, it could be trustees, it could really be anything. But sharing something that you can both look at together so that you flip from presentation mode into huddle mode. That's how you flip outsiders into insiders. That's quality number one. Let's talk about quality number two, which is to convince yourself before you try to convince others. Convince yourself first. So imagine this scenario. You're in a hallway, you're with some colleagues, and all of a sudden an idea, inspiration strikes. And it's an idea that really gets you excited. And so you blurt it out. You share it with that circle. And you kind of look around for everybody's reaction, and everybody's reaction is kind of like, that's kind of interesting. Some people are sort of shrugging their shoulders. People are saying, nah. I think we've all been there before. And when that happens, when their excitement doesn't match our excitement, it can be deflating. So, what I have found is I try to understand, what is it that actually makes someone convincing? And I assumed when I was writing this book that it was going to be fancy hand gestures, it was going to be eye contact, it was going to be pacing, all the traditional Dale Carnegie, Toastmasters, communication skills. But that didn't end up being the case. Some Backable people, sure, are extroverted, they're gregarious, but others are very shy and introverted. But the thing that they all do is they convince themselves first before they try to convince others. And if you want an example of that, just go look up the number one TED Talk of all time right now. Most popular TED Talk. Over 65 million views. And it's a guy named Sir Ken Robinson who gives a talk on education. And it's a great talk, and you believe every word that he is saying. But it's a very un-TED-like presentation. He sort of has a hand in his pocket. He's got a bit of a slouch. He kind of meanders in and out of his script a little bit. It's a very un-TED-like presentation, but it's very, very powerful. Because again, it's not charisma that makes a person backable. It's conviction. Backable people take the time to convince themselves first. And then they let that conviction shine through whatever style it is that feels most natural. So what are some practical things, some practical techniques to keep in mind when it comes to convincing ourselves? Well, one of the first things is that when you're in that situation again and an idea comes to mind, ask yourself, just take a moment and ask yourself, is this an idea that I feel high conviction for? If the answer to that is yes, then by all means share it in the moment. But if the answer to that is no, you don't necessarily feel high conviction, then consider taking what I call incubation time. Incubation time with your idea. And one way to think about incubation time is that every new idea, no matter how great it is almost like a chocolate M&M. It might look a little shiny on the outside, but if you squeeze it, it cracks. And what you're looking to do during incubation time is you're looking to turn a chocolate M&M into a peanut M&M. And so you can squeeze it and it won't necessarily crack. Now, you don't need to take endless amounts of time to do this, but it's just enough time to start building some of that conviction so that you can share the idea with a higher level of confidence. So what's happening during this incubation time? Well, it could be as simple as literally just writing your idea out, putting it down on paper. And personally, I like to use just pen and paper when incubating my ideas. I used to be a slide person. I used to put ideas down on slides immediately. But what I found is that when you're writing out bullets and you're writing out slides, it's much easier to ignore the why. It's much easier to ignore the logic behind your idea. But when you're writing things out in full sentences and paragraphs, it really forces you to answer, why is it that you're doing this and why is it that this makes sense? And you can start to do something that I think is really important, which is to steer into the objections of your idea. You can really start to put the other person's hat on, the person who's going to be, in charge of deciding whether this is a good idea or not. You can put their hat on, and you can start to steer into those objections yourself, and you can start to answer those questions. But oftentimes I have found that we want to have the idea fully baked in our head before we actually start putting effort into it, before we actually start writing it down. We want to reverse that. We want to be able to throw away lots of work, put ideas down on paper, and if it doesn't make sense, that's okay. Start with another clean, fresh piece of paper. When I was thinking about becoming an author, I've been wanting to write a book for many years, and when I was in law school, an author named Salman Rushdie was passing through town. And I'm a huge fan of his work. And so I cold called him. I cold emailed him several times asking him, hey, would you be willing to meet with me for just a few minutes and talk about what it's like to be an author? And finally, I think he got tired of my emails and said, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to be at this location at this time. And if you show up 5 minutes early, I'll meet you there and we can talk a little bit. And so I do. And when I get there, first question that I ask him, I can just immediately tell, is a question that kind of annoys him. The question I ask is, how do you get inspired to write? And he looks at me, and you can tell he's very generous, but he kind of rolls his eyes a little bit, and he says, look, I don't get inspired to write. I just write. I sit down at my desk just like anybody else every morning, and I start writing. And most of what I write ends up in the trash bin. But in that pile, I'll find little pearls, little things that make sense. And my job as a writer is to string together those pearls. Eventually those pearls become sentences, which become paragraphs, which become chapters, which become books. And that's how I write. So when you're incubating an idea, don't be afraid to throw away work. Don't be afraid to throw away that piece of paper and start with a fresh one. Those are the things that we need to keep in mind when we're convincing ourselves first. So quality number 1 was to flip outsiders into insiders. Quality number 2 was to convince yourself first. Quality number 3 is to share an earned secret. Share an earned secret. What do we mean by that? What is an earned secret? Well, one of the people that I studied for this book was an Oscar-winning filmmaker named Brian Grazer. He's won over 40 Oscars, over 130 Emmys. He invests in companies. He runs large teams. And so when I was sitting there waiting in his waiting room, there were people there ready to pitch him on films and company ideas and apply for jobs. And you could just tell that the room was pretty nervous. People were pretty anxious. And so when I went back to go see him, I asked Brian, I said, look, if I could go out to that room right now, all those people waiting to pitch you, and I could give them one piece of advice, what would that be? And he thinks about it for a moment and he says, give me something that I can't easily find on Google. Give me something that is not easily Googleable. And I found that to be so interesting because as I talk to more and more decision makers, what I realized is that great ideas tend to be based on a surprise insight, something that you have gone out and discovered yourself, something that's not easily Googleable. The other day I was talking to someone who was looking to apply for a job at a social media company. She's a mother, she's looking to return to the workforce, but the problem was that she didn't really engage with this social media product herself. But she realized that her daughter did. So she did something really clever. She interviewed her daughter and then all of her daughter's friends on what their experience was like. And then she had them send her screenshots, these moments inside their experience that really stood out to them, things they wish were different, things that really delighted them. So now when she shows up to the interview, she showed up with this gallery of screenshots that she started to show to this hiring manager. This hiring manager was so impressed that not only did she get the job, but in the middle of that meeting, he brought in one of the UX designers, the people in charge of user experience, right into the middle of the meeting over Zoom and said, "You've got to check this out." So all of a sudden, she goes from somebody who's not even using the product to somebody who's educating the team just by simply going beyond Google, just by simply putting herself into the story. So how do you find an earned secret? Let's make this really practical and technical. Well, the first is, as we've discussed, go beyond Google. Go beyond Google. Talk to customers. Test drive the product. Go to meetings that are more obscure or meetups where you can learn information that most people in your shoes would not already know. You know, when I was pitching my company, when I was starting out as a founder, one of the things that I did to get new customers onto my idea, onto my product, was I would stand outside of Weight Watchers meetings. See, I was running a healthcare company, and it was a healthcare app, and it was to help people who were struggling with obesity and hypertension and diabetes. And so I found my first customer simply by standing outside of Weight Watchers meetings. And as someone was about to walk in, I would say, "Hey, would you mind if I gave you a little demo of this new thing that I'm working on?" And most people would say no, but every once in a while, someone would say yes, and I would. And that's how I got my first customers onto my product. Now, I would have thought that that would be a story that I wouldn't want to share inside the room when pitching investors, because it's not a very sophisticated way of getting customers. You know, especially for a technology company, you think about, well, I use Facebook advertising, and I use Instagram advertising. It's not that I was standing on the street somewhere. But that turned out to be the part of the story that investors seem to appreciate the most, was that I put myself out there. I put myself into the story. I went beyond Google, and I got insights from firsthand experience. That was the part of the story that I seemed to appreciate the most. So the other thing to keep in mind when it comes to finding an earned secret is to take it one step beyond what most people in your shoes might do. Just literally one step beyond that. So think to yourself, like, what would most people do if they were in my shoes? The amount of effort they would put into this process. And then find a way to go one step deeper. One of my favorite stories from this book is about Howard Stern. Howard Stern had written a few best-selling books, and there was an editor that wanted to get him to write another. But Howard Stern was like, "Look, I've already written a few best-selling books. I'm not really interested in writing another one. There were a lot of work." And so for years, this editor is trying to get Howard Stern to write a book, and Howard Stern keeps saying no. And finally, one day, this editor is sitting at his desk, and he realizes something. He's taking the normative approach. He's doing what any editor would do. What if he could take it one step further? And so what he did is he started to comb through all of the transcripts that he could find from Howard Stern's interviews, and he personally started to select the best moments from these interviews. Then he took all that, collated it together, eventually from hundreds of hours of work, printed all of that out, and put it in a leather binding. Then he shows up at Howard Stern's apartment, and Howard Stern's like, "Oh God, not this again, not another pitch." And the guy says, "I don't have a pitch for you. I actually have your book." And he hands him this book. And Howard Stern looks at the book, and he looks at him, and he's like, "How could I say no to this?" Howard Stern looks back at that moment as what he describes as being intoxicated with effort. He was intoxicated with effort. And it's very hard for someone to say no when you've intoxicated them with effort. That's what we mean by going out there, putting yourself into the story, and finding an earned secret. So just to recap a little bit, we're flipping outsiders into insiders. We're convincing ourselves first. or finding an earned secret, let's talk about one more quality together, which is to play exhibition matches. Play exhibition matches. Backable people who tend to be really, really great inside a room, in the vast majority of cases, are the product of lots and lots of practice. I like to call these exhibition matches. They're these low-stakes practice sessions before the high-stakes moment. They practice and they practice and they practice. And oftentimes, this practice is pretty sloppy. One of the mantras that Backable people use is that long-term success comes from short-term embarrassment. Long-term success comes from short-term embarrassment. But if you're going to be embarrassed, you might as well be embarrassed in front of friends. You might as well be embarrassed in front of people that you trust. So after you've gotten past your incubation stage and now you're ready to share this, start out by sharing it with people who are friendly to you. In fact, Backable people tend to surround themselves with 4 different types of people. People who play 4 different roles. And I like to consider these the 4 C's. And the first C is your collaborator. Your collaborator. Now, your collaborator is somebody who is constantly building on top of your ideas. When you're with them, you almost feel like you're in a musical jam session together. They're using language like yes and they're really helping you build on top of the idea. That's your collaborator. That's the first C. The second C is your coach. Now, your coach is different than your collaborator because while your collaborator is focused on your idea, your coach is really focused on you. Does this idea really fit you? When I was, before I started my own company, I was working at an e-commerce company called Groupon. I started at the company when it was a really early stage startup and, helped over the next 3 years. We grew it into a big public company. And when I left, all the ideas that were on my mind for starting my own thing were e-commerce related because I had spent the past 3 years in e-commerce. And so I put all of my ideas into a spreadsheet and I went to one of my mentors and I shared the spreadsheet with her. And she looked at my spreadsheet and then she asked, which of these ideas makes you come alive? And I looked back at my spreadsheet and I realized that none of them did. None of them really made me come alive. The story that she told me in that moment was how Martin Luther King really stepped into leading the civil rights movement. And there's this great story about, the fact that Martin Luther King was very young. He was in his early 30s at that time. And so he went to a mentor of his and he was trying to seek some guidance. And he said to Howard Thurman, this mentor, he said, look, I think this would be what's happening right now. This movement is really good for the world. It's very important for the world. And Howard Thurman said to Martin Luther King, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. So your coach is someone who isn't just going to tell you what the world needs. That person's going to be honest with you about what makes you come alive. Because let's face it, when we're going through new ideas, when we're putting anything new into the world, we're going to be on the other side of doubt. We're going to be on the other side of rejection. We're going to be on the other side of failure. And in order to sustain that, we need to have enough emotional runway, enough emotional gas in our tank so that we can keep going. And your coach is somebody who's going to be honest with you about whether that idea really makes you come alive. Your third C is your cheerleader. Your cheerleader. And I know that can sound a little bit cheesy, but we all need a cheerleader in our lives. I talked to a woman named Ellen Levy when I was writing this book, and Fast Company magazine named Ellen Levy the most connected woman in Silicon Valley. But when I asked Ellen, who's the person that you call before you walk into the room? She said, that's easy. It's my mom. She literally has members of Congress and Fortune 500 CEOs in her Rolodex, but the person that she calls before she walks into the room is her mom. Because we all need that last bit of confidence before we walk into a room, before we walk into a big moment. Because a backable moment can change our life. And we want to make sure that we're walking in with that right mindset. The fourth C is your critic. Your critic. But I like to call this person your cheddar. And here's the reason why. If you've ever watched the movie 8 Mile, Eminem is surrounded by a group of friends, and I'm coming to you right now from right outside of Detroit, so I love this movie. And in this circle of friends, there happens to be one friend named Cheddar, who's always kind of poking holes in Eminem's ideas. He's always kind of tearing them down just a little bit. But what we find throughout the course of the film is that it's Cheddar that really prepares Eminem for the stage. It's Cheddar who really helps make Eminem who he is. And the cheddar in our lives, we all have one, can be pretty annoying sometimes. They're always kind of poking holes in our ideas. They're always kind of telling us what's wrong with it. But if you find a cheddar who has your best interest at heart and still can point out your blind spots, it's a total gift when it comes to becoming backable. Because oftentimes we need other people to point our blind spots out before we walk into a room so that we come in prepared. So embrace your cheddar. Embrace your cheddar. The 4 C's again: your collaborator, your coach, your cheerleader, and your cheddar. Now, it's important not just to find these people and find this circle, but it's also important to understand how to interact with that circle. What do you do when you're actually dealing with these people? And one of the things that I have found that's really, really important is to make sure to follow what I call the golden rule, which is to seek to understand before being understood. Seek to understand before being understood. Now, when you're getting feedback, we're always sort of, it can be very tempting for us to say, you know what, well, actually, let me rephrase, or let me explain that. But we will have time to do that. The first step, though, is to really understand what that person is saying. And the 3 simple words that you can say is, please tell me more. The 4 simple words that you can use are just, please tell me more. I'd love to learn more. Please tell me everything you can. I'd love to learn that. The second technique to keep in mind when it comes to playing exhibition matches is to really pay attention to nonverbal cues, someone's nonverbal cues. One of the authors that I spoke to for this book is Neil Strauss, and he's written multiple best-selling books. And he told me that when he's done writing the manuscript, the first draft of the book, one of the things he'll do is he'll ask a friend if he can literally read the book out loud to that friend. And what he'll do is he will pay attention as he's reading the book out loud to all of the facial cues, to all of the expressions that his friend has while he's reading the book, and he'll make little notes in the margin. Because oftentimes we reveal things about how we like an idea through our body language. Someone might say, yeah, that seems like a pretty good idea. But is that believable? You're paying attention to more than just the words. You're paying attention to the energy that's beyond the words. The third specific technique when it comes to playing exhibition matches is try not to ask, what do you think? Because oftentimes that's the thing that we do, right? We'll share an idea and we'll say, well, what do you think about that idea? But the problem with that is that, that's really setting it up for a sort of, I think it's pretty good, sort of response. But that doesn't really give us the signal that we need. So one of the things that I encourage you to do is to ask that person to describe your idea back to you. Tell me what you heard. Can you describe that idea back to me? Because what that will do is it will tell you what's actually resonating, what's standing out, and what's not. The other thing it might do is it might actually give you a better way of explaining your idea than you had in the first place. So ask the person you're playing an exhibition match with, how would you describe that idea that I just shared with you back to me? One of the things I realize about Backable is that it's not just a skill for business. It's a skill for life. And the same thing is true about building our circle. Building our circle isn't just helpful for our career. It's helpful for our life. A couple of years ago, I took a trip to the Kingdom of Bhutan. And Bhutan measures its country, its progress, based on what they call gross national happiness. And so I spent a bunch of time with the researchers out there, just really understanding, how do you measure this? And are there specific questions that you can ask to really understand someone's level of happiness? And they said to me, as a matter of fact, there actually is one question that we like to ask. And that question is, if you were having a tough time, if you were in trouble, who could you call? And they believe that people who have an easy answer to that question, I'm going to call that person and that person, they tend to be happier. But there was a twist to that. And the twist is that who can call you and know for sure that you would be there for them? They believe that that is just as important for someone's level of happiness, is to know that they are part of another person's circle as well. NAIS community, I know that this has been a tough year. I know it has been a tough year, and you have come out ahead. And even though we can't all be together right now under the same roof in the same room, we can still be part of one another's circle. Thank you so much.